Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 6th chapter in the book of Acts. Here we read of an organizational milestone in the early church. We also meet Stephen, who has a brief but shining career in in the Bible. He is the first Christian martyr, and the way this chapter ends sets the stage for his dramatic speech, of which gets him killed in the temple in Jerusalem. But it's a miracle that they even made it this far because they were answering for their lives. There are three main things we read of in the 5th chapter. One, a husband and wife couple known as Ananias and Sapphira are smitten dead for lying to the Spirit. According to the principles of communalism, they were to donate all their wealth, but they held back a portion of the house they sold, and they lied to the Spirit, so they were struck dead. Then we witnessed the apostles performing miracles of healing, and they also got themselves in hot water for healing a crippled beggar who had been crippled from birth in front of the temple house, and they accused them of orchestrating a fraud, so they sent them to jail. And there an angel opens them, lets them out, so the jail is no bar for them. And they return teaching, and the high priest noticed, and the high priest were puzzled and wondered what this might be. But one came and reported to them, saying, verse 25, "Look, the men who you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people." So they returned back to the very center of where this had been the angel's command. They had guided them from the temple where they had been arrested, broke them out of prison, and brought them right back to do the same thing. And then in 28 we read, saying, "Did we not strictly command you not to teach in the name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your teachings, and intend to bring the blood of this man upon us." So the reason they didn't want his name being taught is this myth of the resurrection, as they saw it, was detrimental to the status quo. It attracted all these converts, plus these apostles performing miracles. None of them had the miracle touch, so they wanted. With good reason, from their vantage point, for their status quo, strictly speaking, pragmatically, they did the right thing for their advantage to command them not. But there is an unstoppable, irreversible force, the Spirit in whom they witness. And Peter answers, we have to obey Elohim rather than men, so there comes a time in everyone's life where we have to make that decision. We can profit from their example and make the right decision, the correct one. We are to obey men within reason, respect all legitimate functions of government, but government's authority is legitimate, but it is limited. So if they interfere with our conscience, then we have to obey Elohim rather than man. That is an act of civil disobedience, which may prove necessary in our lifetime. And, they give the witness to him, and then we meet a Pharisee by the name of Gamaliel. His most famous student is Paul, then known as Saul, and he may have been present in the 6th chapter. We'll get there when we get there, the town of Cilicia, but his teacher is of the opposite extreme. He counsels to let them go and let's see what comes of it, and he gives all these examples of these recent messianic pretenders, Toda and Judah of Galilee, and they self-destructed. There was nothing to their claims. And now I say to you, stay away from these men and leave them alone, because if this plan is of the work of men, it shall be overthrown. But if it is of Elohim, you are unable to overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against Elohim. So he's giving them a word of warning and caution that there might be something to this movement. There might be something, and they may be Spirit saturated and God ordained, so you don't want to mess. You could, I know you're the upholders of the Sanhedrin, but you could be going against the one you ostensibly worship and suppressing this movement. They're ready to kill them. The early apostolic church almost went extinct, save for Paul's moderate teacher's intervention. Then indeed they went rejoicing from the presence of the council, because they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. So the fact of their suffering is ordinarily no cause to rejoice, but they considered it an honor and a pleasure and a delight, because they were considered worthy from heaven they were happy to suffer and bear the shame for his name, the name by whom they had performed the miracles. And daily in the temple and in every house they did not cease teaching and bringing the good news, Yahshua Messiah. So they wasted no time. They went from prison. They were on a one-direction course, one direction forward. They had to get this word out. And the 7th chapter witnesses the climax of their ministry to the Jews. Then it goes to Samaria, then to the Gentiles after. So that is the foundational verse of Acts 1:8 establishes that trajectory, the order of the Great Commission. And they are still in Jerusalem, and verse 1, chapter 6, book of Acts. And in those days when the disciples were increasing, there arose a grumbling against the Hebrews by the Greeks, because their widows were overlooked in the daily serving. So these were Grecian Jews. They weren't Greeks. They were Grecian Jews, and the early church was at this point exclusively Jewish. It's not until the 10th chapter that Cornelius is opened in. But there was this division, and the Grecian Jews felt neglected. They may have been there at Pentecost and stayed with them. The universal assembly is not very universal at this moment in time, this historical juncture. They are confined to Jerusalem, but there are still problems, and from these growing pains they learn and adapt and implement a division of labor that was necessary to quash the source of the controversy and to continue to organize and grow, because they're growing beyond capacity at this point. Once they never let down, it says, daily they were in the temple and they did not cease. So there was a perpetual motion about them. And because of that, there was results. They had cast the widest net and fished that many men. So the 12 summoned the group of the disciples and said, "It is not pleasing for us to leave the word of Yahweh and serve tables." The 12 would have been the apostles, known as the disciples in the Gospels, but here disciple is broad. It is all the saints. So that word appears 263 times. The word Christian itself appears 3 times, the first of which is Acts 11:26. That's where they were first known as such. So it is disciples, that is, and the nature of the apostles' protest is that their ministry belongs in the word. They are overextending themselves. They are trying to do too much. So they initiate a division of labor. They can no longer. They have to stay concentrated on the higher priority and leave this growing, because the amount of food that would have been necessary to distribute would have been beyond their capacities. They could, they had to spend time grounded in the word. So too does every pastor. So that this gives birth to the office of the deacon. "Therefore, brothers, seek out from among you 7 men who are known to be filled with the Ruach Kadesh and wisdom, whom we shall appoint for this duty." So it's not exactly clear which of the 12 is speaking, but it is clear who he is speaking to. He's speaking to the disciples, the larger group, and he's telling them to look for one who has the 2 qualities, the Ruach Kadesh, that would have been unmistakable, it would have been recognizable. Those who have been visited and it takes a spirit-saturated person to recognize and connect to one across the room. That's why we gather together for church. But they also had to have wisdom. And so the distribution of this food problem required prudence and tact and wisdom and the Spirit to serve them and guide them. And they will appoint the 7. The 12 will appoint the 7. So there was originally 7 deacons, and there is usually more than that number, often more than that number at a local church. "But we shall give ourselves continually to prayer and to serving the word." So their priority, their main agenda was to continually don't get out of the rote of prayer and serving from the word. The word defines the message. It gives meaning to the ministry. So we who minister we have to assign a division of labors, because the church is more complicated than just a sermon alone. There are needs that have to be met and financial obligations, and we're not necessarily the most qualified to handle pecuniary matters, we have to stay focused. Our job, our division of labor, as established here and ever since, has been to never give up, stay all day, every day in the prayer and in the word, so that we know how to use it when the time comes. And the word pleased the entire group, and they chose Stephen, a man filled with faith in the Ruach Kadesh, and Philip, and Procos, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenes, and Nicholas, a convert from Antioch. So the first of these is Stephen. We read of his fantastic speech in the 7th chapter in the temple. He is the first post-Messiah martyr of the church, and he was murdered in the temple, stoned to death at the consent of Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul. And he was also filled with faith, and the Spirit was strong and palpable and noticeable in him. In Philip, we meet him in the 8th chapter. He's the one who not only evangelizes Samaria, but also converts an Ethiopian eunuch, thus sending the message to the ends of the earth. He took it all the way down to Africa from Jerusalem. The man an angel intervenes with him and sends him to someone who is struggling to interpret the meaning of Isaiah 53. And the rest of these have no mention outside of right here, but interesting story. The Nicolaitans, the heretics that John addresses twice in his 2nd to 3rd chapters, I forget precisely which church they were prominent at, but they claimed a dubious descent from this Nicholas, the convert from Antioch. So he wasn't a blood-born Jew. He was a convert. He originally hailed from Antioch. This is the future capital of the church. Once they become a Gentile-oriented movement, Antioch kind of displaces Jerusalem as the site and center. Whom they put before the apostles, and when they had prayed, they laid hands on them. So the laying on hands is a familiar sight, and it's a transfer of authority, and it's been observed by many in generations since. And the apostles were the ones who, every action, every ritual we undergo at church must be preceded by prayer. That is the logically prior thing. Never enter into any act of worship without satisfying prayer first. And the physical act of laying on hands signaled the transfer of authority, and that is alive and operational today in many denominations. And the word of Yahweh spread, and the number of the disciples increased greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. So the word is flourishing. They adapted to the right thing. Because of this division labor, the word could spread throughout the city. They were growing exponentially throughout the city, so much so that even priests, those who worked in the temple, and those who were prominent Jews, perhaps, may have been deflected to their side because of the word that was spreading so powerfully, and there was something beyond their... it was an irresistible force that neither the Sanhedrin nor anyone else could resist, although Saul of Tarsus certainly does try to resist. He takes the Sanhedrin's attitude and tries to stamp it out, because what happens after Stephen is martyred, persecution is a seed that scatters it scatters the seed for things to grow. So they get out of Jerusalem, they just take it wherever they go, wherever they are, wherever you are. The church is not a building but the people in it, so wherever you go, the church is there with you. And Stephen, filled with faith and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. We don't have any indication of the precise nature of these miracles, but it is interesting that formerly all the miracles had been performed by the apostles, the healings, and just everything else. But Stephen, a deacon, that word serve translates in the Greek original as diakonos, but he's also filled with faith and power. That power comes not from him, but the Ruach Kadesh. He was a spirit-saturated man, and through his touch and his influence and his power, he was able to perform miracles among the people. So these weren't miracles that he did on himself. He did it to benefit someone else. And the purpose of miracles is not trickery, amazement, or entertainment, but to benefit other people. That is an authentic miracle. But some of those of the so-called congregation of the freedmen, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia in Asia, rose up, disputing with Stephanos. So the congregation of the freemen, they were Jews, and the original message would have been spread in synagogues, the churches. They were not even meeting in homes. They were preaching and proclaiming what they thought was the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, and a lot of Jews didn't like that. And the Cyrenia was about the midway point between Carthage and Alexandria. Alexandria was the second largest city, and Cilicia was where the town of Tarsus was, where Saul hailed from. So he may have been rising up, disputing with him, but they were unable to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. So he has an irresistible power, an irresistible force, a superior strength on his side, before which none of them can stand, none of them can confront, none of them can answer him and satisfactory and live to tell the tale, because his wisdom and the spirit, the two qualities that they were looking for in the third verse in the deacons, he had an abundance of these qualities, so much so that, they are powerless to withstand his wisdom and the spirit which speaks through him and animates him. Then they instigated men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and Elohim." So they can't beat him. They won't confront him head up. What do? They snivel behind his back and slander and try to destroy his. This is a libelous accusation, because they had the reputation. Now, a lot of Jews were quite irrational about the laws of Moses, and they thought he was a threat. They didn't understand what he means by fulfilling the law, so he said he came to fulfill the law. And so that the blasphemy to even affirm anyone outside of Yahweh as divine was blasphemous according to them. So they said it and they spread it because they couldn't do it the honorable way. They couldn't confront him. They couldn't counteract his argument. So they go behind his back like little weasels. And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes. So they came upon him, seized him, and brought him to the council. So they mean business. They get the mob on their side, and they stir him up. They rip him into a frenzy, drive him crazy, get them excited. And they seize him and bring him to the council. They mean business. This would have been the Sanhedrin. He is back in the temple. This would have been the center of their ministerial activity at this time. And they presented false witnesses who said, "This man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this temple and the law." So this is the slander that they hope is going to stick, that he blasphemes against the temple and the law. The Jews were equally irrational about the temple. They idolized it, and it became a substitute for God himself, much in the same way the law. They worshiped the letter of the law. They didn't worship the spirit or the one who gave it. They satisfied themselves by external obligations to the law, and for this man never spoke blasphemy. He says that the temple will be I think he quotes somewhere in here, or he echoes what the Savior says in John 2:19, that 3 days I will tear you. I could be wrong on that, but we're just going to read the next verse. "For we have heard him saying that this Yahshua Messiah shall overthrow this place and change the institutes which Moses delivered unto us." So he didn't quite change the institutes or the ordinances or the law of Moses. They're still in effect. They're just no longer. There are three components of the Mosaic law we need to know and understand. The first of which is the moral law. This is anything derivative of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and these are absolutely binding in every generation, so we are bound by them. The ceremonial law is mostly obsolete. The animal sacrifices certainly is, because the Savior satisfied that as the atonement, capital A, THE, capital as well. And then the social law are the secular laws, and because ancient Israel was so at radical variance with most modern places, not every law is effective, so we have to we look at them and learn from the principle that is expressed in the law. But, they're just the Yahshua of Nazareth. There's no indication that Stephen ever knew him in the flesh, but he was a post-resurrection convert, and he was filled with the Spirit. So he knew there was truth in this resurrection. So the overthrow of this place, he did say that I will tear it down in 3 days and raise it up. That was a reference to the resurrection. The Jews didn't know that in John's 2nd chapter. And all who sat in the council, looking steadily at him, saw his face was like the face of an angel. So they know something's up. This man is not ordinary. He is supernaturally blessed. He has an angel flying over him, and this angel's going to protect him while he says what he needs to say to condemn the people for, and in the 7th chapter, he also deflates their elevation of the temple by quoting the prophet Isaiah. That's all the time we have for today. This is, we did one, I think we did Moses' biography in the New Testament. We covered some of the material in this chapter and linked it with Hebrews 11, but we didn't cover the full range. We might do that eventually, but that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.